When I was a boy, there wasn't much in this world that I loved more than riding the East Tennessee back roads with my Granny Tollett. Now, she never did put much stock in staying out on the main highway. "You can't learn nothing on a straight road, child," she'd say as she squinted out over the steering wheel of that old 67 green Ford. "It's the curves and the hollers that teach you something." Well, on this particular afternoon, we had gone over toward Grainger County to sell several crates of Granny's homegrown tomatoes. And on the way back, instead of heading straight home, Granny took one of her shortcuts that turned out to be as long as a sermon and twice as crooked. Before you knew it, we had wound up around a ridge and dropped down into a little valley, and that's when I saw it. Sitting high up on a hill, underneath a stand of big sugar maple trees, was the prettiest old farmhouse that I'd ever laid my eyes on. Now, even though it was showing its age in its current weathered form, now you could see what it had once been. 2 stories tall, and it had once held a wide front porch that wrapped around the entire front of the house. The porch roof had fell in the far corner, and the windows were now just empty black eyes, as honeysuckle choked the fence line and the young maple saplings were poking up through what used to be the front walk. "Granny," I said, with my nose pressed to the truck window, "how come no one lives there? That's the nicest old place I've ever seen." Granny cut her eyes over at it, and then quickly back to the road. And then she got that faraway look that she sometimes had, like she was watching something that had happened from a long time ago. "Well, that's the old Miller place, or at least it once was. But child, ain't no one lived in that house for going on near 50 year." "50 years?" I asked. "Why? Did it catch on fire? Was it haunted?" "Law, child, don't you know? Every empty house is haunted by something, honey, but it just ain't always ghosts." We drove on a piece, but we were both quiet, and I knew that look in Granny's eyes, and I knew better than to pester her, because if you tried to drag a story out of Granny before she was ready to tell it, she'd clamp her lips just as tight as a walnut hull in winter. After a while, Granny finally pulled off to a gravel spot on the side of the road just in front of the old house and killed the engine. "Law, child, it's been many a moon since I thought about that old house." And just like that, Granny was about to begin another master class in storytelling. Now, JD, this was long before you were ever thought of. Matter of fact, as I recollect, I wasn't much older than you are now, but I remember it well. You see, that house belonged to a couple named Joe and Annie Miller. Now, Joe was one of them big-shouldered men that worked from can to can't. He was a quiet fella that farmed that bottom over yonder along the creek. He planted corn and bacca and a bit of hay, and even kept a few milk cows and hogs. There weren't much that he couldn't fix with a bit of baling wire and a hammer. And Annie was something to see in her day. Just as pretty as a picture, but she had a way about her. Child, you ever know someone that could walk into a room and make it feel like the sun had just come out? Well, that was Annie. She kept that house all shining like a new dime, with white curtains in all the windows and flowers growing tall along the porch. Folks said you could eat off her kitchen floor, though I always thought it sounded mighty uncomfortable. Well, anyways, Joe and Annie hadn't always had it easy. That's right. They had lost 2 babies when they were first married, back when the sickness came through one winter and took a passel of young'uns down in the valley. And to make matters worse, after that, Annie couldn't have no more babies. She carried that sorrow all quiet like women did back in those days. But there it was in her eyes, if you looked close enough. Still, her and Joe were as close as bark on a tree. You'd see 'em every evening sitting side by side on that big front porch. Him with his long legs all stretched out, and her knitting or mending on one of his work shirts. And they'd be talking low and easy like, and folks said they had a good life. Well, at least the best they could make of it. Well, time went on and the years passed, and Joe, he got a little more stooped in the shoulders, and Annie got a little more silver in her hair. Now that farm, it never did make 'em rich, but they kept going. Then one spring, I guess this would have been right after the war, I reckon, everything changed. Granny paused for a moment, looking out at the house on the hill as a single crow flapped across the sky. Child, you need to understand something. Sometimes the worst things in life, well, they don't come with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they slip in all quiet like, just like a fog, until you can't hardly see what's right in front of you. Now, Joe had always had a temper, and he wasn't mean. He just had a quick temper, like a summer storm. He'd blow up all fast, and then it'd be gone just as quick as it started. Now, Annie used to say,
"Joe, you could blister paint with that tongue of yours, but you don't fool me none."
And then she'd just pat his arm, and he'd grunt and finally cool down. But that year, the bank in town changed hands, and a fella from up north took over. Then the prices on tobacco dropped, and the big companies started squeezing all the little farmers. But Joe, he had a bad spell for 2 straight years. His crops didn't do right. The first year it was from drought, then the next it was from too much rain. And before you knew it, Joe was behind on the note for the place. Now, he didn't tell anybody at first. That's just how men were raised back then. A man kept his worries under his hat, and he hoped that nobody saw the difference. The only problem with worrying, well, it's just like sour milk. It don't hide well. And before you knew it, Joe started spending more time in town, claiming that he had business down at the feed store or over at the co-op. But soon, wagging tongues spread the word around that Joe had been down at the pool hall more than what was good for him. And there he was listening to the fellas promise that they knew a surefire way that he could catch up on those payments if he just laid down a few dollars on a bet. And child, when you give a desperate man a dice cup, you might as well hand him a shovel for his own grave. Now Annie, well, she was nobody's fool, and she knew something was wrong. But every time she asked, Joe would just wave her off. "No, there ain't nary a thing to fret about, Annie. I'm working it out." That's right, Joe was stubborn. And pride's a hard thing to put in your pocket, especially for a man who's always provided. Well, one Sunday evening, Joe came home a little later than usual, and he smelt like sweat and cigarette smoke, and his eyes were all dark and hollow, like someone had turned out the lights behind him. And there was Annie, standing at the sink, still washing up the supper dishes. She had kept his plate warm in the oven, like always, with roast chicken and taters just waiting on him. But Joe, he just walked right past it and grabbed the coffee pot off the stove and sloshed himself a cup with a shaking hand.
"Joe,"
Annie said,
"are you okay?"
But child, instead of answering, he just snapped. "Why ain't that damn barn door fixed? Like I told you, that hinge has been hanging there for 2 weeks." Now Annie, she could hold her own, and she just set that dish down and turned to face him with soap all the way up to her elbows.
"Joseph Miller, if you think I've been up here twiddling my thumbs all day, waiting on a door hinge, you've lost what little sense the good Lord gave you. I've been milking and churning, and I weeded the whole back garden, and then I baked you that pie, sitting right there on the counter."
Now child, under different circumstances, Joe might have chuckled and just kissed her on the cheek and said something soft. But worry had been gnawing on him until there wasn't much patience left. And then he just snapped. "Pie, we're 2 steps away from the poorhouse, and you're wasting sugar on pie?" And in that moment, Annie went still. Child, that was it. The whole truth came spilling out. The missed payments, the bank man's warnings, and all the money that Joe had thrown away while trying to make a quick buck with pool. And Annie just listened without saying a word, with the dish towel still hanging limp in her hand. And when Joe was done, child, that kitchen might as well have been a churchyard. It was deathly quiet.
"So all this time you've been walking around here looking at me like I was the problem, while you were losing our home 1 nickel at a time."
And Joe's face just got red. "Don't you turn this on me, woman. I did what I had to do to keep us afloat."
"No, Joe. What you did is what your pride told you to do, and you shut me out. We're supposed to be partners. You don't get to gamble with my life without me knowing."
Now, JD, you gotta understand something, child. Married folks fight from time to time. It's just the truth. You put 2 sinners underneath one roof, and sooner or later, they're bound to bump into each other. But a good many quarrels blow over by morning. But sometimes a word gets said that you can't call back. And it's like a bullet that's been shot out of a gun. And that's what happened to Joe when he said, "You want to say and everything so bad? Maybe you should have married yourself a different man. I've done the best I can. And the truth is, this place has always been too much for you from the very start. Maybe you'd have been happier down in town wearing a store-bought dress with some rich fella, because that's all you care about is money." Well, Annie just flinched like he had slapped her.
Is that what you think about me after all these years?
And in that moment, the damage was done. Annie took off her apron all slow-like and folded it carefully and then laid it on the counter. And then she wiped her hands and straightened her shoulders and walked right past him down the hall. And after a bit, she came back with her old carpet bag, the one she had brought when they first moved into the house. She looked him square in the eyes and she said,
"I'm going to stay with my sister over in Rutledge for a spell. Maybe once you've had time to think, you and this house can decide if you want me back as a wife."
And with that, she walked out the door. Now, if Joe had a lick of sense, he'd have gone after her right then, child. Pride's killed more marriages than infidelity ever thought about. But he just stood there, listening to her footsteps on the gravel, and then the closing of the gate. And all the while, he told himself that she'd come back by morning. Only, child, she didn't. Granny sighed and shifted in her seat. The late afternoon sun was leaning down over the ridge, throwing long shadows across the hood of that truck. Well, anyways, on her way to her sister's, Annie's wagon had to cross over the old wooden bridge over Ridgeland Creek, and it had been raining hard off and on for a week. And that creek, well, it was running high. A fella who was coming from the other side saw it all happen. One of the main beams under that bridge finally gave way with a groan like the world was breaking. And just then, Annie's wagon went sideways, and the horses panicked and reared up. Well, Annie, she tried to jump clear, but that entire bridge gave way underneath her. And the next morning, they pulled her out downstream, but it was too late.
Minutes turn to days, and colors turn to gray without you. Memories start to fade, and everything is pale without you. And I can feel the love my mind runs free above whenever you're with me.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 4 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today.
For a long time after that, folks didn't see much of old Joe. He buried her up on the hill behind the house, under one of those maple trees. He put a stone with her name and then 2 little lambs carved on it for each of the babies that they had lost. And then he shut himself up in that house like a man doing penance. He did just enough farming to keep himself alive and pay the bare minimum on the place. And folks said that he even quit sleeping in the bedroom at all and made himself a pallet on the porch sometimes, or on the floor by the cold stove. They said he couldn't stand the bed that they had shared all those years without hearing that last argument over and over in his head. Years went by, and life went on all around him. Babies were born, and old folks died. Wars were started and ended, but Joe Miller's world, well, it just shrank, and he lived his entire life from the house to the barn to the field and back again. I recollect one Thanksgiving. I went up there one time with my mama to take him a baked ham. I remember looking all around that pretty house that had turned gray and dusty, but it felt cold somehow. Child, grief will do that to you, and it'll even freeze time if you let it. Mama asked him if he needed anything, but Joe just said, "No, ma'am, I've got all I deserve." And seeing how bad he was hurting, Mama started to say something about forgiveness, but Joe just cut her off. Miss Tollett, the Lord can forgive me if he wants, but I ain't sure I can. Now, honey, that there's one of the saddest sentences I've ever heard. Well, that winter, they found Joe sitting in his chair by the front window, looking out towards the ridge where Annie was buried. The fire had gone cold, and so had he. And he didn't have much close kin, so they laid him out right beside Annie, underneath those maples. And the house, well, it's just been sitting ever since then for the last 50 years. I took a long look at the house and I asked, Granny, do you think the place is haunted? Law, child, the meanest ghosts you'll ever meet in your life are the things that you wish you said and didn't, and the things that you did say that you can't take back. Always remember this, child. Always tell the truth sooner, and always say, I love you, louder. Just then, Granny took one last look at Joe and Annie's home as she fired the old Ford back to life. The old house, the wood was rotten, but the dirt, it remembered. The hill had seen its share of sorrow, but it had seen its share of love too. And someday, some young couple might drive by and see that sagging roof and the busted windows and say, you know, I think we could make something special out of that old place.